I thought the worst thing that could happen was discovering my wife's betrayal. I was wrong. That was just the beginning. What I uncovered next would destroy careers, expose corruption, and change my life forever. Landon Barrett had always been a man of order, a strategist in both his personal and professional life. He thrived on structure, approaching every decision with careful calculation. His ability to foresee challenges and pivot when necessary had earned him respect in his field and a sense of stability at home. Despite the pressures of his demanding career, he had managed to maintain a carefully curated balance, sharing an organized and predictable rhythm of life with his wife, Evelyn. But beneath that polished surface, small fractures had begun to form. The unspoken weight of modern life, career ambitions, fleeting moments of connection, and the quiet compromises that build up over time, created an underlying tension. Their communication was efficient, almost clinical, built on a methodical exchange of itineraries and schedules. It was a system that had served them well for years, a foundation of reliability and order. But even the most carefully constructed foundations can weaken under the strain of the unexpected. At first, Landon barely noticed it, just a minor inconsistency in a routine that usually ran like clockwork. His latest business trip had taken him out of town, as it often did, and as usual, he left behind a detailed itinerary for Evelyn. In return, she provided him with updates on her schedule, a ritual they had refined over the years. By Thursday morning, however, the unexpected happened. The deal he had been negotiating wrapped up far earlier than anticipated. What was supposed to be a weekend-long endeavor came to an abrupt conclusion by 11 a.m. when his clients, facing a sudden crisis at their East Coast operations, departed earlier than planned. Landon, a skilled negotiator and an expert problem solver, suddenly found himself with free time he hadn't accounted for. Originally set to return home Saturday night, he now had an open window, a rare and unexpected opportunity to surprise Evelyn. And so, with an uncharacteristic sense of spontaneity, he booked an earlier flight. What awaited him back home, however, was something he could never have anticipated. Landon decided to return home early, wasting no time in changing his flight. By early afternoon he was en route to Seattle, eager to surprise Evelyn. As the plane cruised through the clouds, he pulled out his phone to inform her of his change in plans. His first call to their home line went unanswered. Odd but not entirely alarming. He dialed her office next, expecting to hear her familiar voice or at least be transferred by her assistant, Rachel. Instead, the receptionist answered, sounding slightly flustered. "Evelyn?" There was a pause before she replied, "She's not in right now." Landon frowned. That didn't make sense. Evelyn had told him she'd be in the office all day, tied up with meetings and calls. "What about Rachel?" he asked. "She's out as well," the receptionist responded. A strange ripple of doubt passed through him. It was rare for Evelyn and Rachel to be away at the same time, especially without any mention of it in their usual schedule updates. But he pushed the thought aside. Maybe they had stepped out for a late meeting or a client dinner. There had to be a logical explanation. By the time his flight landed, however, that uneasy feeling had only grown stronger. Landon pulled into the driveway around 6:30 p.m., expecting to see the house warmly lit from within. Instead, it was dark. Evelyn was usually home by 6, sometimes earlier if she wrapped up her workday remotely. The sight of the empty driveway sent a flicker of unease through him. Shaking off his exhaustion, he carried his luggage inside, unpacked, and fixed himself a quick dinner. He told himself not to overthink things. Maybe she had run errands or met up with a friend. But by 8 p.m., concern turned to something heavier. He called her cell. It rang twice before she answered, her voice carrying the usual cheerfulness. "Hey babe," she said. "How's the trip going?" There was something about her tone, too light, too practiced. "It wrapped up early," he replied, testing the waters. "I'm home." A brief silence. Then, "Oh, that's great, but I wish I had known. I would have planned something for tonight." "Where are you?" "At the office," she answered smoothly. "The campaign for Harper and Shaw finally came through, so I'm celebrating with the team. It's been a long week." That was true. The Harper and Shaw account had been a major win for her firm, something she had poured months of effort into. It made sense that she'd be out celebrating. And yet, Landon closed his eyes, listening carefully. The faint sound of clinking glasses, laughter in the background, it all matched her story. But something about the way she spoke felt restrained. Like she was choosing her words too carefully. She promised they'd celebrate together when he returned on Sunday, as originally planned. Their conversation ended on a warm note, but as he set his phone down, the unease still lingered. Something didn't feel right. Unable to shake the feeling, Landon found himself pulling up the location-sharing app they had used for years. It was a habit born out of practicality, keeping track of each other's whereabouts during busy schedules. He hesitated for a moment before tapping on Evelyn's name. The pin dropped, not at her office but in an upscale neighborhood in Medina. Landon's stomach twisted. Medina was an exclusive, gated area lined with million-dollar homes, far removed from downtown Seattle. He had no reason to recognize the address. But Evelyn's location wasn't just near the neighborhood. It was inside it. His hands gripped the wheel as he drove, his mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was a work-related event, maybe a last-minute meeting with a client. But why hadn't she mentioned it? The street was quiet as he approached. Towering evergreens and high brick fences shielded the grand estates from view, their wrought iron gates standing tall and impassable. Then he saw it. Evelyn's gray BMW, parked neatly in the driveway of a house he didn't recognize. Landon felt his chest tighten, a sharp, painful pressure. He pulled over down the street, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. His vision blurred for a moment as reality started to settle in. This wasn't an office party. And Evelyn wasn't where she said she was. Landon gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his breath shallow. His mind raced between anger, disbelief, and the crushing weight of reality. He couldn't go home, not yet. But he wasn't ready to drive far either. Instead, he found himself pulling into a quiet cafe in Bellevue, ordering a Belgian waffle he had no intention of eating. He pushed the food around his plate, staring blankly at the syrup pooling on the edges, his mind replaying the image of Evelyn's car parked outside that unfamiliar house. Every logical explanation he had tried to craft on the way here unraveled. The meeting with a client, the last-minute work event, none of it held up anymore. He had seen the truth with his own eyes, and yet, part of him still clung to the desperate hope that there was some kind of misunderstanding. By the time he left the cafe, his resolve had hardened. He needed answers. Evelyn arrived home later than usual, stepping through the front door with the graceful ease she always carried. Her plaid skirt and sleeveless red blouse were pristine, her necklace, the one he had given her years ago, caught the dim kitchen light as she moved. But something was off. She hesitated as she entered, her eyes darting around the kitchen. The sink was full of dishes, the teapot still warm on the stove. The house was dark, eerily silent. Landon sat in the shadows, waiting. She placed her bag on a dining chair, her steps slow and cautious. Then she turned toward the fireplace. Grabbing the poker, she spun sharply, scanning the room, her body tense. "Landon," she called softly. He emerged from the darkness, his voice eerily calm. "I think the bed you were in Thursday and Friday nights was very lonely." He met her eyes, his stare unflinching. "Care to explain? Help me understand what happened." Evelyn's breath hitched. Her carefully constructed composure cracked as tears welled in her eyes. She covered her face with trembling hands. "Landon, I love you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This had nothing to do with us. Please, try to see that. It was something I felt I had to do. It doesn't change how I feel about you." His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was low, edged with something raw and unforgiving. "That makes no sense." His hands curled into fists at his sides. "How can betraying me have nothing to do with us? What does that even mean?" Evelyn sobbed, shaking her head. "It wasn't about you." He let out a bitter laugh, one devoid of humor. "Not about me?" His eyes burned into hers. "You stood in front of me, in front of our families, and promised you were mine. That we were in this together. You were precious to me." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. "So tell me, Evelyn, how do you reconcile that?" She choked back a sob, her entire body trembling. "It didn't mean anything, Landon." His face twisted with pain. "Didn't mean anything?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "You just spent 2 nights in another man's bed, sharing things that were meant to be ours alone. And you're telling me that doesn't change anything?" Evelyn's cries deepened, her words stumbling as she reached for him. "Landon, please. I'm still the same. I love you. I'm yours." He shook his head slowly, stepping back as if her touch might burn him. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Nothing stays the same. Every choice we make changes us." He swallowed hard, blinking away the sting in his eyes. "And you made a choice that neither of us can ever take back." Evelyn collapsed onto the chair, her sobs filling the silence between them. Landon stood motionless, watching the woman he thought he knew, the woman he had built his life around, break before him. And yet, the most painful part was realizing that she wasn't the only one who had changed. because after this he would never be the same either. Landon stood in the doorway watching Evelyn crumble under the weight of her own choices. Her sobs filled the silence between them, raw and unguarded. "I love you," she whispered through her tears, her voice barely audible. But love, he realized, was not enough, not when trust had been shattered beyond recognition. Not when every moment between them felt like a fragile attempt to hold together something that had already fallen apart. He had proposed a compromise, a desperate attempt at salvaging whatever remained of their marriage. A physical separation within their home, 2 smaller beds instead of the one they had shared for years. A space for reflection. A step toward understanding. But as he stepped out onto the patio, leaving Evelyn sobbing inside, doubt gnawed at him. Did she truly want to fix this? Or was she merely afraid of losing the life they had built? His final words to her, before he left her in that dimly lit room, carried a faint glimmer of hope amidst the devastation. Yet, as he gazed out at the stillness of the night, the truth settled over him like a weight he could no longer ignore. He still loved her. And that was the cruelest part of it all. Landon had always been a man of control, a strategist who played the long game. In the months following Evelyn's betrayal, he channeled his pain into precision. He left his former position and took a new role, marketing director and chief troubleshooter at Fin Systems Incorporated, a company directly competing with Chapman Electronics. His move to Fin was no coincidence. It was calculated. Victor Chapman, the president of the very company Landon had once worked for, had spent months watching his empire weaken. Landon had systematically outmaneuvered Chapman, securing major clients, outbidding contracts, and slowly tightening the pressure until desperation set in. And now Chapman had no choice but to reach out. Sitting across from his former employer in a sleek conference room, Landon listened as Chapman presented his proposal. Better compensation. More authority. A return to his old position, this time with unprecedented control. The offer was comprehensive, a testament to just how much leverage Landon now held. But Landon had one more condition, one not outlined in any contract. "I want you to listen to a story," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, uninterrupted. "All the way to the end." Chapman hesitated, intrigued but willing to do whatever it took. He agreed. Landon leaned back, his fingers tapping lightly against the polished table, his mind drifting back to that night months ago. To the way he had stood on his patio, staring at the distant glimmers of Lake Washington through the trees, struggling to process the catastrophic blow Evelyn had dealt him. To the moment he realized that no matter how much he tried to piece things back together, some things could never be undone. And now, sitting across from a man who had once underestimated him, Landon was ready to tell his story. One that wasn't just about betrayal, but about what came after. Every lie, every evasion, it all chipped away at the foundation of their marriage. Landon had told Evelyn that they might be able to get through this if they worked hard enough, but even as the words left his mouth, they felt hollow. Could love alone fix something that had been so deeply fractured? His feelings for her, once unwavering, had been eroded by her actions and the haunting uncertainty of how deep the betrayal truly ran. Standing alone on the patio, staring out into the night, the weight of their situation pressed down on him. Even now, Evelyn hadn't truly acknowledged what she had done. Her tears, her distress, was it remorse or just the pain of being caught? She had yet to say the words he needed to hear. No real apology. No admission that what she had done was fundamentally wrong. Landon clenched his jaw. Without genuine regret, how could she ever begin to repair the damage? He had always admired Evelyn's sharp mind, her ability to push through setbacks with relentless determination. But now he could see that same strength turning against them. She wasn't focused on reconciliation, she was crafting a defense, piecing together an argument rather than owning the truth. His heart sank further. The love he still clung to felt more fragile by the second, breaking apart with each calculated response, each deflection. Then a sudden movement caught his eye. Evelyn picked up the cordless phone, her eyes flicking toward the patio as if sensing his gaze. Then, without hesitation, she disappeared into the dining room, moving out of sight. A surge of suspicion tightened in Landon's chest. Something was wrong. He stepped back into the house, his presence quiet but deliberate. He could hear her voice now, low, hurried, the tension unmistakable. He took another step closer, straining to make out the words. But the moment he did, Evelyn's tone shifted. Casual. Light. Too controlled. Like she had something to hide. Landon felt his stomach drop. Had there been more lies? Was there still another truth waiting to be uncovered? Landon stood frozen just outside the dining room, his pulse hammering in his ears. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, hadn't expected to hear this. But as Evelyn's voice carried through the partially open door, his body tensed, his breath shallow. She wasn't just talking to someone. She was talking to Paul. And she was admitting everything. Not to him, not to her husband, the man she had betrayed, but to the man she had betrayed him with. Landon's grip tightened on the doorframe as Evelyn spoke in hushed, frantic tones. She confessed that their affair had nearly destroyed her marriage, that she had been lying to Landon in real time while he sat just rooms away, hearing every fabricated word. She told Paul how she had complained about being alone in bed, while Landon had been right there, listening in silence, letting the weight of her deception sink into his bones. Paul's voice crackled through the receiver, shocked, but Evelyn cut him off. And then, as if the knife hadn't been twisted deep enough, she made a new admission. Scott. Another name. Another affair. Landon felt his stomach drop. Paul, now rattled, muttered something about his business partners, about needing a plan to deal with Landon before things got worse. It was only then that Landon realized Paul wasn't just worried about Evelyn's marriage. He was scared. Scared of him. Evelyn's voice wavered as she continued, her desperation spilling into every word. She was terrified, not just of the fallout but of Landon's mind. She admitted, voice trembling, that she knew he would put the pieces together. That his ability to see past her carefully constructed explanations left her feeling exposed. She feared him. Not because he had ever been violent. Not because she thought he would lash out. But because she knew, that once he saw the full extent of her betrayal, there would be nothing left to salvage. Landon closed his eyes, a slow breath escaping his lips. She had been so sure she could control the damage. She had no idea the damage had already been done. Landon stood there, absorbing every word as Evelyn and Paul wove their narrative, a desperate attempt to rewrite the truth before it fully unraveled. Paul spoke with urgency, laying out a strategy, a way to frame their actions as nothing more than a series of unfortunate but innocent events. Exhaustion from a tough project. Mutual support in a vulnerable moment. A mistake fueled by stress and alcohol. Nothing explicit. Nothing concrete. Just enough to maintain plausible deniability. They needed to move quickly, Paul insisted. Involve the other partners. Present a unified front. The story had to be airtight, leaving just enough ambiguity for doubt to creep in, so that if Landon did uncover more, Evelyn could still manipulate the narrative. Evelyn, trapped between fear and guilt, listened in silence. And Landon, standing just outside, clenched his fists as realization sank in. There was no remorse. No regret. Only damage control. He turned away from the door, his body stiff with anger, his mind already made up. Their marriage wasn't salvageable. Whatever hope he had clung to before, however faint, was gone. Landon walked through the neighborhood, the cool air doing little to soothe the storm inside him. His thoughts churned as he pieced together the reality of the world Evelyn had willingly immersed herself in. A toxic system built on whispered favors and silent trades. A quid pro quo. A twisted arrangement that rewarded ambition and punished hesitation. A system where stepping over the line wasn't just tolerated, it was expected. And Evelyn? She had embraced it without hesitation. He couldn't fathom how she had justified it. How she had reconciled the choices she made with the person she once claimed to be. But what cut the deepest, what shattered him completely, was the knowledge that others had refused. Others had been given the same opportunity and turned it down. But Evelyn? She had walked into it willingly. Landon swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. Everything they had built, everything they had been, was now nothing more than collateral damage in her relentless pursuit of success. By the time he returned home, his mind was clear. There was nothing left to save. Evelyn was waiting for him. Her face was tense, eyes searching his for something, reassurance maybe, a sign that he hadn't figured it all out. "I need to talk to you," she said softly. Landon said nothing. He just waited. She took a deep breath. "There's something I need to explain." He almost laughed at that. She was about to test one more lie. Evelyn spoke carefully, her voice measured. She told him about an urgent project. One that had supposedly required 2 days of seclusion in a remote hotel with Paul and a select team. She painted the picture with precision, classified details, high-stakes deadlines, all-consuming work. Her evasive phone calls? The secrecy? Necessary precautions. Landon recognized the script immediately. It had been polished, storyboard, aligned perfectly with her previous statements. The partners had crafted this timeline, refining it into something airtight. Not the truth. Just a lie designed for him to believe. A lie that preyed on his knowledge of her ambition. twisting it into dedication rather than betrayal. Landon met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Evelyn mistook his silence for consideration, for hesitation. She had no idea he had already heard everything. She had no idea that in this moment, as she fed him one final fabrication, she was only confirming what he already knew. She hadn't just betrayed him. She had given away what she once promised belonged only to him. And she had done it without hesitation. Landon sat motionless, his gaze fixed on Evelyn as she attempted to navigate his questions with careful, measured responses. "How many nights, Evelyn?" His voice was steady, controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. "How many nights did you spend with Paul? And was he the only one?" Evelyn's breath hitched for just a moment, a flicker of hesitation she couldn't quite suppress. But instead of denying, instead of confessing, she dodged. "Landon, I told you, it wasn't like that." He exhaled sharply. Still she refused to give him the truth. He leaned forward, his voice quieter now but far more dangerous. "Let's make something very clear. No amount of justification, no attempt to balance the scales by suggesting I should cheat in return, is ever going to fix this. Fidelity isn't something cheap enough to be traded." His jaw tightened. "Two wrongs don't make anything right, Evelyn. You know that." And yet, she still couldn't bring herself to deny his allegations outright. Because the truth, the real truth, was worse than anything she could say. Behind closed doors, Evelyn's firm had been preparing for this moment. They had anticipated Landon's questions, built a narrative strong enough to weather his suspicions. A secret project. A professional obligation. They ensured that every fabricated detail aligned seamlessly. They even had a psychologist ready to vouch for her, framing her actions as part of a high-pressure corporate environment, rather than personal failure. The firm's partners reinforced her story, lending their full support, because Evelyn was too valuable to let fall. And in exchange for her silence, her loyalty, they offered her something tangible. Immediate promotion to partner. No further trials. No obstacles. A seat at the table so long as she kept the illusion intact. For Evelyn, it was the perfect alternative to the humiliating truth. She convinced herself that this had to work, that Landon, pragmatic and intelligent as he was, would be more willing to accept an inconvenient explanation over an unforgivable betrayal. So she sat across from him, her expression composed, her voice steady. "There was a project," she began carefully. "It was highly confidential, only a handful of us were involved. We had to stay at the hotel, secluded, no distractions." Landon said nothing, his face unreadable as she detailed the fabricated logistics. She framed her time with Paul as a professional necessity, nothing more. She even positioned it as a repayment. Paul had helped her on a previous account, and this had been her way of returning the favor. Landon simply listened. And then, with the same unsettling calm, he asked, "How did you get there?" Evelyn blinked. He had barely reacted to her explanation, had let her speak without interruption. But now, this simple question, so casual, so pointed, made something shift in the air. She hesitated. "What?" "The hotel," Landon repeated. "You said it was remote. Who drove?" Evelyn swallowed. We arranged private transportation through the firm." Landon leaned back, exhaling through his nose. There it was. A flaw. A single, careless detail, the kind of mistake that a real story wouldn't have. And Evelyn, so eager to convince him, hadn't even realized it. That evening, Landon sat across from Victor Chapman at an upscale restaurant, nursing a glass of whiskey. Chapman, polished as ever, had extended an invitation to renegotiate, an attempt to win back the man who had systematically outmaneuvered him for months. Landon had other plans. He recounted everything. Evelyn's betrayal. Her firm's systematic corruption. The way they had orchestrated a cover-up, not just for her, but for a network of powerful figures who thrived on silent transactions and hidden exchanges. Chapman listened, expression unreadable at first. Then his jaw tightened. His fingers drummed against the table. "You expect me to believe this?" He scoffed, though his voice lacked conviction. "Evelyn's firm is cutthroat, sure, but this? This is a fantasy." Chapman pushed back his chair, preparing to leave. "I don't have time for—" And then, just as he reached for his coat, he paused. A hesitation. A flicker of recognition in his eyes. Landon saw it. He had struck a nerve. Victor Chapman wasn't just dismissing the story. He was afraid of what it meant. Victor Chapman hesitated, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Then slowly he sat back down. "Explain," he demanded, his voice sharp. "Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me?" Landon met his gaze, unwavering. I want nothing from you, Victor. But you need to ask yourself, how much of this is really a surprise? Victor's expression hardened. The truth was, he already suspected something. Landon was simply forcing him to confront it. By the time their conversation ended, Chapman walked away with more questions than answers. Questions about the integrity of those closest to him. Late that night, Landon's phone rang. It was past midnight, but sleep had been elusive for months. The wounds of betrayal were too fresh, and therapy had done little to dull the torment of losing the woman he once believed to be the love of his life. He let the phone ring twice before answering, his voice rough. Hello? A woman's voice. Hesitant. Desperate. Landon, this is Marjorie Chapman. Landon sat up straighter, tension gripping his spine. I'm outside your apartment, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Please. I need to talk. Marjorie's hands trembled as she clutched her coffee cup, barely sipping from it as she sat across from Landon in his dimly lit living room. The exhaustion on her face wasn't just from lack of sleep, it was the look of a woman whose entire world had just crumbled. I don't know why I'm here, she said finally, exhaling shakily. I had nowhere else to go. Landon waited. Marjorie let out a humorless laugh. He asked me, she said bitterly. Victor. He asked if I had compromised my dignity to make partner at Reed, Lydia, and Grant. Landon's stomach tightened. He had suspected the rot in Evelyn's firm ran deep. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing Marjorie confirm it, made it real. I denied it, she continued, shaking her head. But he didn't believe me. She scoffed, pressing her fingers to her temple. And why would he? I've lied to him every day for 17 years. Landon didn't speak. He let her unravel at her own pace. Marjorie inhaled deeply, as if summoning the courage to keep going. Every single day since I was involved with Scott Reed, Paul Reading, and the other senior partners. I lied. Her voice cracked, but she didn't stop. I told myself I deserved that promotion. That I was just playing the game. That it was temporary. But every time I let Victor believe I had been faithful, I lied. Every time I gave in to one of those younger associates looking to make partner, she trailed off, her shame palpable. Victor knew. Maybe not the details. Maybe not the full extent. But he had known enough to be suspicious. I convinced myself the ends justified the means, she murmured. That I could still be the perfect wife as long as I kept everything in its place. She exhaled sharply, a bitter sound. But the cracks started to show. Victor grew suspicious when I suggested things in the bedroom that I had never been open to before. I pushed past it, convinced myself that as long as I kept our life together, it wouldn't matter. Her gaze met Landon's then, and the weight of her regret was suffocating. I told Evelyn she had to make sacrifices, Marjorie admitted. I mentored her. Guided her into that disgusting system, convinced her that it was necessary to survive in this world. She let out a hollow laugh. And now my marriage is gone. My reputation is gone. And I destroyed yours in the process. Landon leaned forward, his expression unreadable. So why are you telling me this now? Marjorie swallowed hard. Because you were right. About all of it. And because I don't know how to fix it. She hesitated. You told me earlier that if I wanted to salvage anything, I had to tell Victor the truth first. What did you mean by that? Landon's tone hardened. I meant that if you want even the possibility of forgiveness, you have to give him the whole truth. Not a softened version. Not a story tailored to protect yourself. Everything. Marjorie let out a slow, shaky breath. I don't know if I can, she whispered. I'm terrified of what he'll think of me. Landon studied her for a long moment before responding. Then you already know your answer. Marjorie sat in stunned silence, the weight of her own actions pressing down on her. I coached her, she admitted finally, her voice hollow. I told Evelyn how to hide it from you. How to justify it to herself. I told her that love would balance the scales. She swallowed hard. That was a lie, of course. I knew it was a lie. Because my love for Victor never erased my own betrayal. Landon remained silent, letting her words settle. Marjorie let out a slow breath. Plenty of innocent employees work at corrupt organizations. Should we have kept places like Dow operational just for the sake of jobs? She shook her head. No, Landon. This firm has ruined lives. And I won't let it continue. She hesitated, then added, if there's a way to help the innocent, I'll try. But my real focus, is bringing down the system that enabled this. She met his gaze. Victor will support it. I know he will. He's furious at the firm, and I think he wants a reason to dismantle it. Landon nodded slowly. And what about you? Marjorie exhaled. If Victor forgives me, I'll resign. I'll leave the firm completely. We have enough money to walk away. We were already considering early retirement. Landon leaned back, his expression unreadable. That's not enough. Marjorie frowned. What do you mean? We need something solid, Landon said. More than just your testimony. We need undeniable proof. Marjorie hesitated. Where do we even start? Landon's eyes darkened with determination. We get it, he said simply. The truth always leaves a trail. It's time we followed it to the end. Landon reached into his desk drawer, pulling out a small, unmarked disc. He slid it into his laptop, the screen illuminating with the playback window. Marjorie watched as he hit play. An 8-minute recording began. It was Evelyn's voice. At first, her words were smooth, controlled. But as the recording continued, she faltered. She admitted to repeatedly lying to Landon during their phone calls, unaware that he had been listening in silence the entire time. She revealed her guilt, her fear, not for what she had done but for getting caught. Marjorie's lips pressed into a thin line. This is damning? Landon nodded. And this is just the beginning? He sat back, arms crossed. I saved enough during my marriage to cover legal costs. Even after a divorce settlement, I'll have roughly $900,000 to work with. Marjorie's eyes widened slightly. That's a significant amount. I plan to use it, Landon continued, his tone resolute. Marjorie nodded slowly. Litigation could get expensive. The firm will settle, Landon said without hesitation. They can't afford a public scandal. A silence stretched between them as they both absorbed what this meant. They had the motivation. They had the resources. Now they just needed the final piece, the evidence that would bring the entire system crashing down. Marjorie exhaled sharply, rubbing her temples as she processed the inevitable fallout. If this comes out, she murmured almost to herself, the firm will collapse. She listed the consequences one by one, her voice hollow. Intimate misconduct lawsuits, disbarment motions, a mass exodus of clients. The moment the truth went public, Reed, Lydia and Grant would be finished. Despite her agreement to help Landon expose the firm's corruption, Marjorie couldn't ignore her own complicity. She had been a part of this world for years, benefiting from its power while knowing exactly what it demanded. Shaken, she excused herself to the bathroom. Landon heard the faucet run for minutes, then silence. When she returned, her face was bare, her makeup washed away, and for the first time she looked her age, worn, tired, and carrying the weight of every decision she had ever justified. She took a deep breath. I'm resigning, she said simply, citing personal reasons. I can't be part of this anymore. Landon studied her, seeing the genuine resolve behind her words. I wish I could tell Victor, she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. But he won't take my calls. Not since that night. Landon nodded. I'll reach out to him in the morning. Maybe if he hears this from someone else, it'll help him see the full picture. Marjorie gave a weak smile, the gratitude in her eyes obvious. The next day, Landon met Victor Chapman near a quiet golf course, far from the polished conference rooms where they used to clash. Marjorie had told him everything, the real truth. No justifications, no softened edges. She had laid bare every compromise, every decision that had led her to this point. She had apologized, begged for forgiveness, and then she told him she was resigning. Not just for him, not just for their marriage, but because she couldn't live with herself anymore. Victor had sat in stunned silence at first, the full weight of her confession pressing down on him. Then, slowly, something inside him shifted. He listened. By the time they sat down for dinner, some of the life had returned to his eyes. They kept talking, unraveling years of buried emotions, just trying, to make sense of everything. By Sunday they took a long drive together, extending their conversation into quiet hours on the road. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. And when they returned home, Victor made his decision. He wasn't just going to forgive. He was going to help. He and Marjorie would begin the painful process of rebuilding, not just their marriage but the damage the firm had left behind. That night, Victor sat in his study, staring at the empty glass in his hand, his thoughts racing. Then Marjorie walked in, her hands folded in front of her. He looked up, his face unreadable. You're really doing this? She nodded. I am. His expression shifted, anger, disbelief, something bordering on respect. You're resigning, he said flatly. After all these years. Marjorie met his gaze without flinching. Yes. Victor exhaled, shaking his head. Do you even realize what this means? It means I'm finally doing the right thing, she said quietly. She hesitated, then added, You asked me once, years ago, how I justified it. The firm's corruption. My role in it? Her voice wavered. The truth is, I didn't. I just pushed past it. Told myself that success was worth the cost. That as long as I was still your wife, still keeping our life intact, none of it mattered. She swallowed. But it did, Victor. Mattered. And it broke us. For the first time she saw him falter. Marjorie took a step closer. This isn't just about us anymore, she said. It's about the entire system. And I know you, better than anyone. You can't stand corruption. You hate what this firm has become. Victor clenched his jaw but said nothing. She gave a soft, bittersweet smile. You demanded my resignation, didn't you? As part of us moving forward? A long pause. Then finally, yes. Marjorie inhaled deeply, emotion thick in her voice. Then this is me choosing us, Victor? And for the first time in years, she saw something in his eyes that she thought had been lost forever. Belief. Marjorie didn't hold back. She accused Scott Reed of perpetuating the toxic system, highlighting the recent departure of Maya Alvarez, a young associate who refused to compromise her integrity for the sake of advancement. Maya had walked away rather than be indoctrinated into the firm's culture, a decision that now stood as proof that compliance was a choice. The walls of Reed, Lydia, and Grant began to crack. Former associates, emboldened by the growing storm, started coming forward. They corroborated what Landon and Marjorie had already exposed, stories of unethical partnerships, coercion, and a rigged fast-track system designed to reward those willing to pay the price. And then came the rumors. Whispers spread that Landon possessed recordings, incriminating evidence that could bury the firm completely. The partners, once untouchable, were now scrambling. Fear set in. Legal battles erupted, but it was too late. The mere exposure of the allegations caused irreparable damage. Clients withdrew their accounts. Senior associates abandoned ship. The firm, once a legal titan, was hemorrhaging credibility by the day. Landon didn't stop. With each revelation, each testimony, it became clear, this wasn't just about dismantling Reed, Lydia, and Grant. It was about sending a message. A message to those who exploited power for personal gain: you will face consequences. As the dust settled, the fallout was swift and brutal. Paul Reading and Scott Reed, once towering figures in the legal world, found themselves disgraced. Their legal careers were over, shredded by scandal, irreparable in the public eye. Divorces drained their finances, leaving them with only modest annuities to scrape by. They were no longer feared. No longer relevant. The empire they had built on silence and submission had collapsed. And Landon? Victor Chapman had approached him quietly, one final request after the war was won. Let me be. Landon had spent years chasing justice, burning everything in his path. But with Reed, Lydia, and Grant dismantled and its partners facing the fallout, he stepped back from his relentless pursuit. He turned toward something new. Victor, having reconciled with Marjorie, brought Landon into Chapman Electronics, not as an employee but as a troubleshooter. A consultant. Landon streamlined the company, reshaping it into a top-tier competitor in its industry. The same strategic mind that had taken down a powerhouse now built one up. And when Victor retired 3 years later, he and Marjorie left it all behind, purchasing a quiet bed and breakfast on the Kitsap Peninsula. They had finally closed the chapter. Landon moved forward, but not without reckoning with his past. Before committing fully to Janice, the woman who had come into his life after the storm, he told her everything. Every choice. Every pursuit of vengeance. Every moment where justice and obsession blurred together. Janice listened. Though taken aback by the darker side of Landon's past, she saw no reason to fear him. Not for herself. Not for her children. Their marriage was steady, built on honesty and a mutual understanding of what had come before. It lacked the consuming passion of his past with Evelyn. But it held something stronger. Stability. And for the first time in years, Landon was content with enough.